The frontier did not forgive, but one man tried. The law of the land was written in prejudice and fear. When Elias Boone cut down a half-dead Apache girl branded with the words "Justice for Blood," he crossed a line no neighbor would forgive. But what began as a simple act of defiance became a fight for survival, for belonging, and for the meaning of family in a place that knew only division. The sun clung low over the New Mexico desert, painting the mesas in copper fire. Elias Boone rode with the weight of silence pressing down on him. The steady clop of his horse's hooves, a lonely metronome against the shifting sands. He was a man of few words, fewer friends, and one unyielding habit: to mind his own land and his own cattle. Yet fate had a way of ambushing men who thought they had already chosen solitude. The cry came faint at first, so fragile he almost mistook it for wind moving through cottonwood branches. He reined in, listening, his eyes narrowing against the glare. Again it came, a rasping whimper, half human, half ghost. Boone's gut tightened. He knew the desert did not play at mercy. Any sound out here meant something was dying. He urged his horse forward, following the brittle noise until he rounded a dry wash choked with mesquite. And there he saw her. Girl, no more than 13 or 14, slumped against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. Rawhide bound her wrists. Her face, streaked with blood and dust, tilted forward under the weight of a crude wooden placard hanging from her neck. Scrawled in blackened charcoal were the words, "Justice for Blood." Elias's breath caught sharply in his throat. The meaning was plain. Someone had left her here as a message, a warning carved into flesh and wood alike. Her skin, bronze, beneath bruises, told him what the sign already screamed: Apache. And in these parts that was reason enough for cruelty. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching on gravel. The girl's eyes fluttered open at his shadow, wide and fevered, the whites stark against her dirt-streaked face. She whispered something in her tongue, too faint to catch. He crouched, close enough to see the raw rope burns, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. For a moment, he stood suspended in the silence of choice. He knew what the town would say if he touched her, harboring the enemy, betraying his own kind. A man could lose more than cattle for that. He could lose his standing, his land, his life. But leaving her? Boone had lived through war and seen enough graves to know what abandonment meant. He was no saint, no preacher, but there were lines he would not cross. With a low curse under his breath, he pulled his knife and cut the rawhide binding her wrists. The girl crumpled forward, too weak to hold herself upright. He caught her against his chest, shocked by the lightness of her frame. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, yet carried the burden of a war not her own. "Easy now," he muttered, though he knew she could barely understand. His voice was gravelly but steady, the tone of a man speaking more to himself than to her. He lifted her onto his horse, tucking the crude placard under his saddle horn. Its words stared back at him, black and heavy. Justice for Blood. Someone out here thought vengeance was righteous enough to nail to a child's chest. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than it should have. Boone's eyes swept the horizon for dust trails, for riders who might have left the girl there and lingered, to see if their message was answered. The desert offered no answers, only the rasp of wind and the pounding of his own doubts. By the time the adobe walls of his homestead came into sight, the sun had bled into twilight. Boone dismounted carefully, carrying the girl into the cabin. With a gentleness at odds with his calloused hands, he laid her on the bunk near the fire and poured water into a tin cup. She stirred weakly, lips parting, but drank only a swallow before turning away. Boone wet a rag and pressed it to her brow, watching her chest rise in shallow breaths. He had no medicines, no healing skills beyond the rough remedies of ranch life. Yet he knew enough to see she had been starved, beaten, and left to die. He worked, a thought gnawed at him. This choice had changed everything. Come morning, someone would know. Someone always did. And when the news spread, his quiet ranch would no longer be a refuge. Still, as he sat back, the girl's thin hand clutching the edge of his blanket, Boone knew one truth more powerful than fear he could not have ridden past. He would not. And with that decision, the storm of the frontier had already begun to gather at his door. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. Elias Boone woke before the sun, the desert, still cloaked in cold grey light. For years, his mornings had been the same. Coffee boiled in a blackened pot, the slow ritual of saddling his horse, the quiet inspection of his cattle spread. But this morning was different. The girl was still alive. She lay wrapped in his wool blanket, skin pale beneath the fire's dying glow. Her dark hair was matted with dust, her lips cracked, but her chest lifted in shallow rhythm. Boone knelt, listening. Each breath seemed borrowed, fragile, as though one wrong sound might shatter it. He poured water into a tin cup, coaxing her, awake with a quiet word. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, wary, too old for her years. She hesitated, then drank, the trembling of her hands betraying how close she had come to death. Boone studied her in silence. He had no children, no wife, no reason to keep a stranger under his roof. Yet when she looked at him, her gaze was not only fear, but a question, whether the world still had room for mercy. You'll live, he muttered, more promise than observation. He moved about the cabin, frying bacon and cornmeal in his iron pan. The smell filled the air, and the girl stirred, watching him with cautious hunger. Boone broke a piece of bread and set it on a tin plate, sliding it across to her. At first, she didn't move, her body taut as if expecting a trick. Only when his back was turned did she tear at the bread, devouring it with small, desperate mites. Boone pretended not to notice, though a grim ache stirred in his chest. Whoever had left her beneath that tree had starved her first. It wasn't justice, it was cruel, cold, and deliberate. By mid-morning, Boone saddled his gelding and stepped outside to check the herd. The desert stretched wide, a land both beautiful and merciless. He glanced at the horizon, half expecting dust trails, riders who might have followed him home. Nothing moved but wind and circling hawks. Yet inside his cabin, he knew, was a storm louder than any he could see. When he returned, the girl was sitting upright, blanket clutched around her shoulders. She stared at him, sharp and unblinking. Boone sat at the table, pulling the crude wooden placard from where he'd propped it against the wall. The words stared back at him, justice for blood. He ran a calloused thumb over the black letters. You know what they wrote. His voice was low, steady. You know what they meant. The girl's lips pressed tight. Then, after a long pause, she spoke a word in broken English. Enemy. Boone felt his jaw clench. She had been taught what the settlers believed her to be. Perhaps she had learned it from bitter years of encounters, or perhaps from the men who had strung her up to die. You're no enemy of mine, Boone said, though he wondered if the words carried meaning. For her. Not while you're under this roof. For a moment her eyes softened, but then suspicion returned. Trust was not built in a day. The hours passed slowly. Boone cleaned tack, chopped wood, and hauled water, but his thoughts returned again and again to the fragile figure in his cabin. The girl hardly spoke, answering questions with silence or a single word. Yet she watched him always, as if measuring whether this solitary rancher was different from the men who had left her to die. By evening, a sliver of trust showed itself. Boone was whittling at a scrap of pine when the girl shifted closer to the fire. She pointed at the carving, tilting her head. Boone held it out. It was only a crude horse, rough and unfinished. She studied it, then traced the wood with her fingers, a ghost of a smile flickering across her face before vanishing like a shadow. Boone looked away quickly, hiding the unexpected warmth that rose in his chest. A smile, small as it was, felt like victory. But outside, the desert sky darkened to violet, and Boone's unease grew heavy. Word would travel. The men who had left her for dead hadn't done it in secret. They had meant to send a message. And by saving her, Boone had sent one back. The town always knew before a man was ready to tell it. 2 days passed before Elias Boone rode into Dust Creek for supplies. He'd hoped to keep to himself, to buy flour, coffee, and salt without eyes lingering too long. But Dust Creek was a place where silence carried farther than gunshots, and by the time he tied his gelding outside Harper's Mercantile, men were already watching him with too much interest. Boone tipped his hat, shoulders square, and pushed inside. The bell above the door chimed, a sound sharper than it should have been. The conversation dropped low. Harper, the storekeep, forced a greeting, but his eyes flicked once, quick and cutting, to the burlap sack slung over Boone's saddle outside. "You've been riding strange trails," Harper said while measuring sugar into a tin. "Cattle scattered," Boone answered flatly. "Had to fetch 'em back." Harper tamped the lid, sliding it across the counter. "Funny thing, a couple of riders came through. Swore they saw you hauling something besides cattle. Said you had a passenger, a figure slumped over your horse." Boone met the man's stare, unblinking. "You know riders. Dust makes phantoms." But the lie tasted bitter. By the time Boone stepped back outside, 2 men were waiting near the trough. One, a ranch hand named Silas Brant, spat tobacco into the dirt. "Have you been keeping company, Boone? Heard it wasn't the kind you want to show a town." Boone's hand tightened on his reins. "You hear too much," Brant smirked. "Might be the kind of thing a man ought to hear. Folks don't forgive easily, especially not when blood's fresh on the ground. You bring one of them into your house, folks start wondering whose side you're on." Boone didn't answer. He swung into the saddle, spine straight as iron, and rode out. But the words clung like burrs. When he reached his ranch by sundown, the girl was sitting by the fire, her thin frame wrapped in his wool blanket. She looked up quickly, reading the tension in his face. Boone poured feed for his horse, every movement sharper than it needed to be. "They know," he said finally, voice rough. The girl lowered her eyes. Boone realized she understood more, then she let on. Perhaps not every word, but the tone. Fear carried no language barrier. That night he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Coyotes yipped in the distance, but it was the memory of Brant's smirk that gnawed at him? Boone had lived alone long enough to know how fast rumor became law. The next morning, proof arrived. A rider approached slowly, hat brim low, badge glinting in the light. "Sheriff Lang," he reined up at the fence, voice casual but eyes sharp. "Evening, Boone. Folks have been talking. You got something under your roof don't rightly belong," Boone's jaw flexed. "Got a busted stovepipe and a calf with a lame leg. That's what you rode out here for?" Lang shifted in the saddle. "Don't play dumb. Word is you pulled a half-dead Apache girl out of the dust. Folks saw the placard. You know what kind of message that was. They left her for a reason." Boone stood silent, the air between them stretching tight. Finally, Lang sighed. "I ain't your enemy, Boone, but I ain't your shield either. If the town decides you're harboring trouble, I can't hold 'em back. Think on it." The sheriff rode off, leaving only dust in his wake. Boone watched until the horizon swallowed him, then turned back toward the cabin. Through the open door, the girl's dark eyes met his. She had heard enough to understand. She whispered one word, voice thin but steady. Danger. Boone nodded once. Danger, he repeated. Inside, the fire popped. Outside, the horizon seemed to darken with more than clouds. Boone knew what was coming. Men with torches, men with judgment, men who thought justice could be nailed to a child's chest. And when they came, he would be ready. Some truths come quietly, like embers catching in the dark. The storm broke not with riders, but with words. Days passed, each one stretched thin with watchfulness. Boone kept the rifle near, checking the horizon with every chore, while the girl slowly regained strength. She walked unevenly at first, like a foal on unsteady legs, but stubbornness burned in her eyes. Boone found himself making room for her in the rhythms of his life. She helped carry wood, though the logs were too heavy. She insisted on trying. She fetched water, spilling half the pail, but was proud of what she managed. At night, she sat near the fire, listening to him hum low tunes he hadn't sung since boyhood. Still, silence lay heavy between them. Boone could not ask what had been done to her, and she would not tell. Until one night, when the desert wind howled against the shutters and pushed the fire's smoke low into the cabin, she spoke. Her voice was fragile but deliberate, each word an effort. Name is Anoki. Boone looked up from the whittling knife frozen in his hand. He repeated the name carefully. Anoki. She nodded, a flicker of relief softening her face. Then, she pointed to the placard propped against the wall, the one Boone hadn't yet burned. Brother, Boone's chest tightened. What about him? Her eyes glossed with unshed tears. Dead! She tapped the word blood scrawled across the wood, then pressed a fist against her own heart. White men say, justice. The room went still, save for the pop of the fire. Boone set the knife down, leaning forward. They killed your brother, he said slowly, making sure the weight of it settled in. She nodded once, lips trembling. Left you to answer for him. Another nod. Boone sat back, the truth curdling inside him. It wasn't just cruelty, it was theater. A life taken for a life, and a child left as the stage. Anoki's small shoulders quivered. For the first time since he'd cut her down, she let the mask of stone crack, covering her face with both hands. The sound that followed was not a wail but a broken whisper. Grief too long strangled now, forcing its way free. Boone rose, uncertain. Comfort was not a tool he carried, not a thing he'd been asked for in years. Yet instinct pulled him forward. He crouched near her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. You're safe here, he said, his voice low but sure. No man'll touch you while I'm standin'. She lifted her face, streaked with tears and firelight. Her gaze searched his, as if testing whether the promise was only air. Boone held steady, his weathered eyes meeting hers, without flinching, and for the first time, trust passed between them like a spark catching dry tinder. The days after bore the mark of that night. She began to speak more, stringing English words together haltingly. Boone, patient in a way he didn't know he had, taught her names for things in the cabin: chair, cup, fire, horse. She repeated them with a seriousness that made him smile when she wasn't looking. One evening, he found her by the corral, reaching out timid fingers to his gelding. The horse snorted, but didn't pull away. Boone watched, arms folded, a rare warmth stirring in his chest. This land had always been wide and empty, a place to bury loneliness in work. Now, against his will, it had begun to feel less hollow. But the shift came with danger too. Each milepost closer to trust was another mile deeper into risk. Boone knew the town's gossip was sharpening into anger. He saw it in the way riders slowed near his fence line, in the silence when he passed men. On the road. That night, Anoki sat by the fire, her voice barely more than breath. They come? Boone set down his coffee, studying the flames. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe soon." Her hands tightened in her lap. "You give me?" Boone turned sharply. "No." The word rang hard, like steel struck on stone. He leaned forward, his voice roughened not by doubt but by certainty. "I don't give people, not to mobs, not to men who call themselves righteous while killing children." For a long moment, Anoki stared, as if she could not believe the firmness of his answer. Then, slowly, she nodded. The firelight caught her face, weary but steady. Boone realized then that the girl he'd found dying beneath the cottonwood was no longer just a stranger. She had become part of his fight, and he, whether he'd wanted it or not, had become hers. Outside, coyotes cried against the endless, dark. Boone tightened his grip on the rifle beside him. He had chosen, and the choice had bound them both to a road the frontier would not forgive. The first rider carried smoke on his breath and trouble in his eyes. It was late afternoon when Boone spotted the dust plume rising from the west. A single rider at first, then 3, then 5, their silhouettes hard against the sinking sun. Boone set down the axe he'd been using to split kindling and wiped his hands on his trousers. His gut told him this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Anoki stood near the corral, stiffening as she too saw the shapes approaching. Boone's voice cut low. "Inside, now." She hesitated, dark eyes searching his, then darted into the cabin. Boone swung the barn door half shut, his rifle leaning where he could reach it quickly. He stayed on the porch, arms folded, every line of his body telling the men that he was ready. The riders slowed as they reached his fence line, their horses snorting, leather creaking. At their head was Silas Brant, the ranch hand who had spat dust and venom in town days before, his grin spread wide, the kind that carried no humor. "Evening, Boone," Brant called. "Fine weather for company." Boone didn't move. "You've had your say in town. Say what you came to say here." Brant's grin deepened. "Words spread plenty. Folks know you took her in. Asterisk. That little squaw was left as justice and you went and snatched her up like some prize. That doesn't sit right." Behind him, one of the men spat into the dirt. Another adjusted his hat, eyes cold. Boone could feel their hunger, not for justice, but for power, for the thrill of standing on the side of the mob. "She's a child," Boone said evenly. "Ain't justice in killing children. Never was." Brant chuckled, low and sharp. "That's the sermon you're giving?" "The town doesn't see it that way. Blood for blood. That's the way it's always been. Her kin took from us and now she's the reminder. But you make it worse. You shelter her. You shame the dead." Boone's jaw tightened. "I don't answer to mobs, and I sure as hell don't hand children to men too cowardly to face their own sins." The air thickened. Hands hovered, near gun belts. Horses stamped restlessly. Boone felt the moment balance, one breath away from shattering. Brant leaned forward in his saddle. "You think you can stand against a whole town, Boone? You're one man. Folks'll come, more than this handful. Sheriff can't hold them back forever. When it happens, you best not be standing in the way." Boone let the silence stretch, eyes locked on Brant's. At last he said, calm and final, "Then let it happen. But don't mistake me for a man who scares easily." Something flickered in Brant's eyes, frustration, maybe even respect. He spat into the dirt, then tugged his reins. "Reckon you'll find out what easy means soon enough." The riders wheeled, kicking up dust as they thundered back toward town. Asterisk Boone stood still until they vanished over the rise. Only then did he step inside the cabin. Anoki sat near the hearth, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She had heard every word. Boone placed the rifle on the table and met her gaze. "They'll be back," he said. She nodded once, voice small but certain. "Together." Boone felt a weight shift in his chest. The fight was no longer his alone. That night, Boone laid out supplies, extra cartridges, a sharpened knife, the old shotgun his father once carried. He wasn't blind. He knew 5 men were only the start. The question was not if they would return, but when and how many. As the firelight burned low, Boone sat on the porch, the stars cold and sharp above. The desert stretched silent, but he felt the storm gathering. His choice had set the course, and now the frontier would come to collect its price. And when it did, Boone swore he would meet it head on. Nightfall carried more than stars. It carried the weight of men's anger. The sound came first, as a murmur, then a roar. Hoofbeats rolling like distant thunder, torches flickering against the horizon. Boone had been waiting, rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkening trail. Anoki sat inside the cabin, her hands clasped tight around the crude wooden carving Boone had whittled days before. When the riders crested the ridge, there were more than a dozen. Silas Brant at the front, torch held high. Shadows leapt across the desert floor as they fanned out around Boone's fence line. The glow lit their faces, hard, eager, righteous in their own eyes. Boone rose slowly, stepping off the porch. His silhouette cut stark against the firelight. "That's far enough," Brant's laugh cracked through the night. "Boone, you've been warned. That girl doesn't belong here. You hand her over, or we'll take her. Frontier doesn't forgive men who spit on justice." Behind him a voice shouted, "Justice for blood!" The others echoed, a chant rising, ugly and hollow. Then another horseman rode forward, Sheriff Lang. His badge caught the torchlight, his face grim. He raised a hand, trying to calm the storm. "Hold, all of you. This ain't the way. Boone's made his choice, but we're not a lynch mob. We're a town, and the law still stands." Brant sneered. "Law doesn't mean much when graves are fresh. That squaw's kin killed our own, and she's the price. You stand in the way, Sheriff. You'll fall with him." Boone's voice cut across the clamor, low but steady. "She's a child. You call it justice. Leaving her strung up under a tree? That's not justice. That's cowardice. And I won't bend to it." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lowered, their torches, doubt flickering in their eyes. Others pressed forward, anger sharpened by shame. Boone leveled his rifle across his forearm, calm as a man setting a fence post. "First man crosses that fence," he said. "Don't take another step on God's earth." Silence fell heavily. The flames cracked, horses stamped. Boone's, figure lit by fire and shadow, looked carved out of the desert itself. Sheriff Lang edged his horse closer, his voice carrying over the tense stillness. "You all know Boone. He fought beside some of your kin. He buried friends, same like you. If he says the girl's no enemy, I'll stake my badge on it. You want blood, you'll have to go through me too." The standoff tightened, breath against breath. Brant's hand twitched near his revolver. Boone's finger curled against the trigger. One heartbeat could have lit the night with gunfire. Then, from inside the cabin, came a sound. A child's voice, thin, steady, speaking broken. English. "Please, no fight!" Every head turned. Anoki stood in the doorway, the blanket draped over her shoulders, the wooden carving clutched in her hands. Her eyes glistened, but her chin lifted, unbowed. "I have no enemy," she said. The words trembled, but the meaning cut through the dark like a blade. The mob shifted again, murmurs rippled, some men lowering their gazes, others hardening in defiance. Boone stepped closer to her, standing like a wall at her side. "You heard her," Boone said. "No enemy here, only men, who've forgotten what mercy looks like." For a long moment, the night held its breath. The mob, the sheriff, Boone and the girl, locked in a tableau that could shatter with one spark. Brant spat into the dust, fury sharp in his eyes. "This ain't over, Boone. You're one man standing against a town, and sooner or later, that town wins. He wheeled his horse, torchlight flaring, and the others followed, muttering as they rode back into the night. The chants faded with the thunder of hooves, leaving only silence and the acrid smell of smoke. Boone exhaled, shoulders heavy but unbowed. He turned to Inoki, who still stood clutching the carving like a shield. "Inside," he said gently. "It's done, for tonight." But both of them knew the fight was not over. It had only shifted, deeper, into something that would either break them or bind them forever. Dawn broke softer than it had any right to. The desert awoke, with pale light washing over the mesas, painting the world in quiet gold. Elias Boone stepped outside, boots scuffing the dust, eyes burning from a night without sleep. The mob was gone, but the memory of their torches lingered like smoke in his lungs. Inside the cabin, Inoki stirred beneath the blanket, her breathing steady now, not ragged as when he first found her. Boone poured coffee, the bitter steam curling against the morning chill, and watched her sit up slowly. She caught his gaze, then pointed to the wooden carving still clutched in her hands. The crude horse he had whittled had become something more. Her anchor. She held it out to him, shy but insistent. "Safe," she whispered. Boone took the carving back, weighing it in his calloused palm. His throat tightened. He was not a man given to sentiment, but her simple offering struck, deeper than any word. He placed the carving on the mantel above the fire, high and proud. "Safe," he repeated. The day passed with unusual quiet. No riders, no smoke, no threats on the horizon. Boone mended fence posts while Inoki tried her hand at sweeping the cabin, though most of the dust ended up stirred rather than gone. She laughed once, just once, and the sound startled him more than the mob had. That night, as the stars cut sharp and endless above, Boone sat by the fire with his rifle leaning against the wall. Inoki sat across from him, eyes heavy but steady. She spoke haltingly, piecing words together. "You fight for me," Boone met her gaze. "I fought because it was right." She shook her head, pointing at her chest, then at his. "Family," she said carefully. The word hit Boone like a hammer. He had lived years without it, burying the idea under cattle, chores, and silence. Yet hearing it from her lips, cracked and uncertain, felt like truth carving itself into stone. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Family," he echoed, his voice rough with something unspoken. Silence stretched warm between them. For the first time since she'd stepped under his roof, Boone felt the cabin less empty, less hollow. The following morning, Boone saddled his gelding for the day's work. As he tightened the cinch, a small voice called from the porch. "Pa." He froze. The leather strap hung slack in his hands. Slowly, he turned. Inoki stood there, barefoot, blanket draped around her shoulders. Her face carried both fear and hope, as though the word had slipped free before she could catch it. "Pa," she repeated, softer this time. Boone swallowed hard. His hands trembled against the saddle leather. No one had spoken that word to him in years, not since the war, not since burying his own kin. He gave a small nod, unable to form more. "Yeah," he said finally. "Pa'll do." Her shoulders eased, a tentative smile breaking the harsh lines of her face. In that moment, Boone understood something deeper than defiance or survival. He hadn't just saved her life, she had given him back his own. That night, when he set the rifle by the door and stoked the fire, Boone felt the cabin hum with a belonging he had thought the frontier had stolen from him forever. For the first time in years, he wasn't a man alone. The land remembers the choices men make, weeks passed, and the storms of rumor lost some of their thunder. Dust Creek's gossip still clung like burrs, but the mob never returned. Perhaps it was Sheriff Lang's steady hand. Perhaps it was the shame of having been turned back by one rancher and a girl's trembling words. Whatever the reason, Elias Boone's cabin stood unburned, his herd still grazed, and life carved its way forward. Anoki grew stronger by the day. She learned words quickly, eager to name the world around her: sky, saddle, fire, bread. Boone, in turn, found himself teaching more than language. He showed her how to mend fence wire, how to set a snare, how to brush a horse without spooking it. She moved with determination, carrying both the grief of what she'd lost and the stubborn hope of what she might yet keep. One morning, Boone returned from the pasture to find her stacking kindling by the cabin door, humming a tune that was not his own. The sound lifted into the air, fragile but alive, and Boone felt something shift in his chest. The desert had always been cruel, but here was proof it could still grow softer things. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Anoki set the wooden carving back into his hands. It was worn smooth now from her grip. She pressed his fingers around it and said, with careful certainty, "Home." Boone's throat tightened. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of every choice he had made since cutting her down from the cottonwood tree. He looked around, the small cabin, the firelight, the rough-hewn walls, the quiet steadiness of her presence, and realized she was right. Against every warning, against every threat, this was home. Outside, coyotes called across the wide dark. Boone rose, setting, the carving back on the mantel. He rested a hand briefly on Anoki's shoulder, steady and protective. In a land where mercy was rare and vengeance cheap, one man chose differently. He chose to stand, to shelter, to believe that family could be forged not by blood, but by choice. Elias Boone's defiance lit a fire brighter than any torch, a fire that carried through the years, and those who knew the story never forgot. The frontier did not forgive, but in this place, for one girl and one rancher, it learned something close to grace. The fire crackled. The desert wind whispered against the door. And the story ended, not in blood, but in belonging. Thanks for riding through this tale with us, friends. If it struck your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe to ride along on the next journey. Out here on the frontier, every choice leaves a mark, so may yours be marked by kindness.